Hey everyone, this is the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today I'm going to talk about what I call character-driven ideologies. These are ideologies or political behaviors that rely on character of their leaders more than the principles of their ideas. I will give some examples throughout the podcast to make this concept more clear. Now, when I say character-driven ideologies are bad, I'm not saying we must not concern ourselves with character in general. Someone who is of poor character is often unreliable when it comes to sticking to their principles or values. But when we vote for our leaders and representatives purely based on their character or other characteristics like honesty and consistency, we may blind ourselves to bad ideas because we become supporters of that person, not the principles they stand for. An example of this on the right is President Trump. In my opinion, President Trump has done many good things, but when he does bad things, we must criticize him for it and condemn his actions. An example of this on the left is Senator Bernie Sanders. In my opinion, he stands for some of the worst ideas we've ever had in human history, but when he does good things, we should acknowledge his actions. But the most dangerous part of a character-driven ideology is not the blind support for some personality. It's the mindset and behaviors it creates in order to defend that ideology. A character-driven ideology must be defended using character-based attacks. This results in bad faith efforts to paint the opposition as evil people instead of people with a differing opinion. In these ideologies, there's no such thing as disparities, only oppressors and the oppressed. I will elaborate throughout this podcast on this concept. I'll also be going over some promotional material and opportunities at the end of the podcast. I like doing this because it's a lot of repeat information for regular listeners of the Engineering Politics Podcast, and it gives those people the option of skipping that information. But I would love for new listeners to hear what I have to say, and if you like this podcast or any of my other content, please tell your friends and family about it. It's always good to have more listeners and keep building this community. Well, that's it for now. Let's get the show started. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Character is important in politics. This podcast will not dispute that. The lack of character leads to a lack in principles or inconsistency in values. The character of a candidate or absence of it should influence our decisions when figuring out what political figures we should vote into office. But if the ideas that candidate is pushing relies on their character to be successful, proceed with caution. In other words, if someone pushes an ideology that relies on wisdom, intelligence, and compassion of any group of people, that person is asking for power to change your life according to what they believe is best for you. The lesson here being, never trust the human condition. In today's social media culture, we engage in political discussions with faceless avatars without the fear of any real repercussions from what we say. But when we engage with our close friends and family, we typically try our best to avoid hot-button political topics. But everyone has that one friend or family member who posts hardline political ideas with the intention on going into battle with anyone who comments with criticism. If you have a differing opinion, the best case scenario is you hold your tongue and don't engage at all. The worst case scenario is you comment on a post and 24 hours later and 159 comments in, that significant someone tells you where you can shove your differing opinion. An instance like this was my motivation for making this podcast. To be more specific, replying to a political opinion from a close friend ended in a few broken friendships, which were since then mended, greatly due to the thesis of this podcast. An argument over a character-driven ideology will result in a character-driven criticism by those who believe that ideology. In fact, one of the main virtues of a character-driven ideology is to use character as a weapon to earn votes or slander the opposition. This is a common strategy that is not exclusive to only one side of the political spectrum. The right wing has had their run-ins with the character-driven ideologies in the past. We have mostly seen this in the right wing in Europe, with fascist dictators promising a healthier and stronger society if they would be given power to eliminate the people who oppose their ideas. And as I've explained in previous articles and podcasts, you can read my piece titled Conservatism Defined for more context or listen to the Engineering Politics Podcast number 2. There's a big difference between the right wing in Europe and its American counterpart. Character-driven ideologies have been pushed by the right wing in the US, but in a much smaller capacity. This is a tendency of all human beings. Most people truly believe that they could make the world a better place if they just had the power to change circumstances in an instant. Like a genie granting you 3 wishes, godlike powers to change the world for the better, that sounds like a good deal as long as the person with the power is a good, pure-of-heart individual who has the best of intentions on how to use that power. But there's a major problem with that line of thinking that is dependent on how you view the world and human nature. Thomas Sowell called this the conflict of visions. Now, if you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, I strongly recommend you stop listening to this right now and pick up any book written by Dr. Sowell so you can learn from the best nonfiction author I've ever read. Thomas Sowell wrote a book called A Conflict of Visions in which he explains how differing worldviews change the way you see certain ideologies. In his book, Sowell explains there are 2 different broad categories of how we view human nature: the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. Sowell defines the unconstrained vision as man is capable of directly feeling other people's needs as more important than his own, and therefore of consistently acting impartially even when his own interests or those of his family were involved. He continues to define the constrained vision as trade-offs are all we can hope for. Prudence, the careful weighing of trade-offs, is among the highest duties. The main contrast between the constrained and unconstrained visions is the human ability to force change in human nature. The unconstrained vision sees human behavior as completely or mostly malleable and can be altered under the conditions given by certain ideologies. The constrained vision imagines human behavior to remain largely unchanged by conditions set by human influence. An easier way to explain this is analyzing the effects of social and economic policy through the lens of each vision. A free market, also known as capitalism, is the free exchange of goods and services without the interference or influence of government for the exception of enforcing laws. For individuals who see the free market through the constrained vision, a free marketplace is the best economic and social option because it allows human nature to act on its best impulses. If an individual is greedy, that person must provide goods or services to build capital and fulfill their greedy tendencies. If a producer is prejudiced against another group or does not want to employ or sell to that group, that producer then loses out on the opportunity to select employees from the largest talent pool, decreasing the chances at finding the best quality employees, and decreases the size of their consumer base by not selling to certain groups of people. People who look at the free market through the unconstrained visions will make the opposite characterization. Producers will only do what is in their best interest and accumulate wealth that increases their influence over the poor and lower economic classes. A fixed market, also known as socialism, is the ownership of the means of production in some capacity by the state. A fixed market viewed through the constrained vision is the worst possible economic and social option because action is now dictated by the state, not the producers and consumers in that marketplace. The government will use social conditioning to do what they see best for the people regardless of what the people want. A fixed market viewed through the unconstrained vision is the best way to get as close to a utopia as we can. Social conditioning is the best way to advance humanity. Each vision sees ideologies largely dependent on how they manipulate human behavior. Just like the extremes of the political left and right are not correct on every issue, the answer lying somewhere in the middle, the extremes of a constrained or unconstrained vision are not correct either. We do know we can change human behavior through systems like government, religion, and other forms of social conditioning. We also know human behavior can be rigid, especially when it comes to evolutionary behaviors. A common modern view of human nature is we used to be controlled by our nature, but now we have the technology and innovation to transcend our constrained bodies and minds into unconstrained territory. The use of drugs and human genetic manipulation allows us to evolve faster than ever, but the conflict of visions is often not a matter of if and how, but a matter of should and ought. Thomas Sowell wrote another book on the topic of visions called The Vision of the Anointed, which was written before his other book, A Conflict of Visions. This book goes over what Sowell would later call the unconstrained vision and how people who hold that vision refuse to fail at implementing their worldview, whether it achieves its intended goal or not. An example Sowell uses is the war on poverty and how more government control was the method used to fix the issue. The crisis given by the Johnson administration in the 1960s was there were too many people in poverty and people were growing dependent on assistance. The solution to that problem was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The results of that act increased the number of people dependent on government assistance to remain above the poverty line, even though that number was decreasing before the act was passed. And a quick side note, overall poverty in general was already decreasing before the act was passed. Yet advocates of that legislation, and other legislation intended to fight poverty, hold the poor up as a social group who must be helped. This creates more advocacy for policies that enlarge or ignore the problem. Thomas Sowell refers to these targeted groups as mascots. Sowell explains, a mascot's own well-being is not so crucial as its role in enabling others to make a statement. Many social groups are treated as human mascots of the anointed, whether or not that ultimately works out to the benefit of those groups themselves. Many people who hold visions of social engineering policies as a greater good will ignore the results of their policies for the greater good. To bring this back around to character-driven ideologies, unconstrained visionaries rely on the character of the powerful to lead the rest of us to greener pastures. Omnipotent leaders will make decisions for the flawed population. This advancement towards perfection often results in a win-at-any-cost mentality. If government programs fail, it's because they're underfunded or undercut by the opposition who wants you to fail. In reality, no one person or small group of people can decide what is best for every individual. The answer to the world's problems does not rely on the ideas of a few men, but on the cumulative knowledge of every individual. This doesn't mean the character of our leaders is not important, but rather the character and health of our culture is. Since these ideologies rely on positive character arguments for their leaders and supporters, they also rely on negative character attacks on their opposition. Conversely, ideologies that don't rely on character, but rather law and the oath to the Constitution, must not attack character because it weakens their argument. This is demonstrated in the previous example of free market employment. A producer who lacks character and relies on prejudice will most likely result in selecting from a smaller talent pool and more turnaround with their employees. Poor character is punished by a system in the form of less efficient and effective production, not by arbitrary rules set by a governing body. A character-driven ideology relies on self-defined good character of those who support that ideology and the contrasting poor character of the opposition. Because of this, character attacks by those who support these ideologies not only use character attacks often, but must use them to prove their points. This is why heated arguments on certain political ideas on social media result in broken friendships and hurt family members. As I explained before, character attacks are not only used by both sides of the political spectrum, but are most commonly used by those pushing character-driven ideologies. The example I see most of this behavior is posed by Bernie Sanders and his supporters. Senator Sanders is a perfect example of someone who holds a character-driven ideology and the policy positions that come with it. Almost all of his positions start with the premise that one group is made of people of high character, and they are being oppressed in some way by a group of low character. The poor are poor because of the rich. The sick are sick because of evil corporations. The minority is oppressed because of the majority. Not only is every crisis a result of one group oppressing another, but the solutions are based on power given to a moral authority. This moral authority can force equality on the population. Whether or not the moral authority solutions work is irrelevant because they can always demand more power to correct all imbalances. In a perfect world, we could give power to a pure-hearted leader who would only do what is best for the people. The obvious problem with this is who defines what is best for the people. But for the sake of argument, let's assume this leader makes all the decisions that improve our lives. That would be great for 4 to 8 years until that person no longer holds public office and someone new comes in. I always say to my Bernie supporting friends, if you want Bernie to have the power he's asking for to make the changes he wants to implement, then you have to be okay with someone like Trump having that power too. The only way around this inevitable reality is to get rid of the democratic election process and start a dictatorship. This is similar to what China recently did because the most efficient way to run a socialized government is through dictatorship. If the government has absolute power over the economy, that power becomes extremely volatile if there is sudden change in government majorities through democratic elections. A dictatorship is less volatile if the person or majority that is in power are made of high-character people who can't be voted out of power. The civilian population have a better chance of being governed without all their liberties being taken away. Of course, no one person or majority ever keeps power, as we've seen throughout human history, which is why all socialized governments eventually fall into tyranny. They always come to the same conclusion since most of these ideologies revolve around the promise of equality. The easiest way to make everyone equal is to make everyone equally poor. Understanding why your friends and family may attack your character in defense of their ideas is important if you want to have a productive dialogue. When the character attacks come, make sure you let them know that you are arguing in good faith. Make it clear you assume they want to help people and have no sinister motives, and that they should grant you the same position. Intentions should never be assumed out of convenience because that creates a straw man argument. If that strategy does not shut down their defenses, the next best option is to let them know you're willing to have a discussion once they can agree on making a good faith argument and walk away. I will end this podcast with a quote from Thomas Sowell from his book, The Vision of the Anointed, because he perfectly sums up what those who advocate for character-driven ideologies believe. Sowell wrote, "In the anointed we find a whole class of supposedly thinking people who do remarkably little thinking about substance and a great deal of verbal expression. In order that this relatively small group of people can believe themselves wiser and nobler than the common herd, we have adopted policies which impose heavy costs on millions of other human beings, not only in taxes but also in lost jobs, social disintegration, and the loss of personal safety. Seldom have so few cost so much to so many." This concludes this podcast on character-driven ideologies and how those ideologies, if enough people don't expose them for what they are, will send us driving down the superhighway to hell. And as I said in the introduction, I'm going to let you in on a few new exciting opportunities. One of these opportunities comes in the form of expanding the reach of engineering politics onto different social media platforms. One of these platforms is ThinkSpot. ThinkSpot is a new platform surrounded around healthy discourse, diversity of thought, and challenging ideological assumptions, which makes sense considering one of the creators of ThinkSpot is Jordan Peterson. ThinkSpot is different than other platforms like Twitter and Facebook because the tools within ThinkSpot are optimized to promote healthy discourse instead of shutting it down. An example of this is something like the traditional like button that has been replaced with several quick options to share constructive praise or criticisms. ThinkSpot, as of today, is currently in a closed beta testing process. You can sign up to join the closed beta, but I will make sure to let you know when the full version is released. Another social media platform featuring engineering politics is the Rubin Report community. The Rubin Report, created and hosted by Dave Rubin, is a subscription-based community. This separates this platform from the others because trolls and bots are not willing to pay a subscription fee, no matter how small, to troll a community. Although this platform is filled with content created by the Rubin Report, there is another element to what Dave is trying to create. This element is called Locals. Locals is a subscription-based community solution that gives power to the creators, not the platforms. This means any content creator, and by creators I mean podcasts, articles, books, art, clothing, non-binary, action figures, you get what I mean. But any creator can start a Locals community and produce content for their audience. Supporters of that community can consume free content or pay a subscription fee to consume limited subscriber content. Now, this isn't a new idea, paying someone to get their special content, but no other platform builds this type of relationship between a creator and his or her supporters. And of course, engineering politics is part of this community and has its own community. Actually, one of the first communities ever created on Locals. So, this is me asking if you enjoy this content. whether in this podcast format or on the website. Please join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can show your support by paying a monthly subscription fee so I can keep producing independent content. Or you can just join the community for free and get its content right away as it's released. The only way we can build a culture of independent thought, honest debate, and free speech is by building communities like these. So let's build a community together. For more on Locals community, read my new article titled Building a Community on my website on the written content page. Well, you made it to the end. Until next time, this is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.